Thank you, Mr. President. I am here to deliver my time to wake up speech, which I do every week that the Senate is in session. And we've been out of session for a few weeks. So there's a fair amount to talk about that happened while we were gone. One of the first things was a new study in Rhode Island, my home state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island is a coastal state, and we have considerable worries about sea level rise, and we have a state coastal resources management council that has done what is probably the best modeling anywhere in the country of the effects of sea level rise and the risk of ocean storms on our shores. And in conjunction with them, there has been a report from the Rhode Island Division of Planning. This is the state government, which has identified roads and bridges that are most likely to be underwater as the tides climb higher and as waves push further inland. The state's 10 most vulnerable roads to sea level rise are Hope Street in Bristol, which everybody knows, a beautiful historic street, Memorial Boulevard in Newport, Wampanoag Trail in Barrington, Canonicus Avenue in Jamestown, County Road North in Barrington, North Road in Jamestown, County Road in Barrington, Beach Street in Narragansett, Main Street in Warren, and State Highway 24 South in Tiverton. Throw in storm surge on top of sea level rise, and the 10 most vulnerable roads become County Road North in Barrington, Phillip Street in North Kingstown, America's Cup Ave in Newport, the Route 138 West on-ramp in Newport, Hope Street in Bristol again, Highway 24 North in Portsmouth, Centerville Road in Warwick, Narragansett Avenue in Narragansett, Main Street in Warren, and Route 138 West in Jamestown. The report goes on to identify the 10 most vulnerable bridges to sea level rise and the 10 most vulnerable bridges to a combination of sea level rise and storm surge. Overall, Warwick, Narragansett, Newport, Barrington, and Providence are our top 5 municipalities most vulnerable to climate change-related road damage. So, colleagues, when I come here to talk about this is not some hypothetical liberal concern. My Coastal Resources Management Council in my home state is predicting 9 vertical feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. As the presiding officer knows, Rhode Island is not a huge state. We don't have a lot to give back to the ocean. 9 feet of sea level rise is potentially catastrophic. And when my state division of planning is highlighting the roads and bridges that we're going to lose to sea level rise and to storm surge, don't expect me to sit idly by. So there's a larger context, of course, for all of this. I'm pretty Rhode Island-centric, but boy, are we seeing a lot going on. Let me start with what's going on out west. We have an extraordinary wildfire situation happening in the American West. Wildfires, I'm reading a news story here. Wildfires burned across hundreds of thousands of acres in the American and Canadian West this week, fueled by scorching temperatures that are breaking heat and fire records across the region. In California, at least 15 cities have seen record-breaking heat. The state has experienced its hottest summer on record. San Francisco hit 106 degrees over the weekend, breaking its previous high ever by 3 full degrees. By the end of the day Tuesday, there were at least 81 large fires blazing across 1.5 million acres of the U.S. West, from Colorado to California and north to Washington. These unprecedented extreme events are exactly the types of events that are more likely, due to the global warming that's already occurred, say the scientists. Studies find that a warmed global atmosphere with increasingly clear human fingerprints will continue driving a potent mix of heat and dryness that's projected to escalate in the West. The climate scientist at UCLA says that's not a future projection, but an observational reality. And that's something we expect to increase in the future. When we get these extremes, he says, there's a human fingerprint. The increased occurrence of severe heat and the role of global warming on the occurrence of severe heat, that's already happening, said a Stanford scientific research. And this is not a fluke. 9 of the 10 worst fire seasons in the past 50 years have all happened since 2000. And 2015 was the worst fire season in U.S. history, surpassing 10 million acres burned for the first time ever recorded. So far this year, wildfires in the U.S. are at 7.8 million acres, and the fire season is far from over. Researchers have shown that human-induced climate change accounted for about half the observed increase in fuel aridity, forest dryness, that is setting off these fires. In the western U.S. since 1979, and that this had nearly doubled the area of the U.S. West affected by forest fires since 1984. The conclusion: we know that global warming has already increased the probability of unprecedented high temperatures in the western U.S., included in California. And we know, the scientists say, with high confidence, that continued global warming will continue to intensify those increases. Last week in Montana, a 20-square-mile blaze burned the historic Sperry Chalet, a hotel and dining room built in 1914, only reachable by trail. Been there more than 100 years, but this is the fire that burned it down. This means a lot out in Glacier National Park. It's hard to think about the magnitude of what's happened, the National Park Conservancy Executive Director, Doug Mitchell, said. One of the western fires even jumped the Columbia River to burn across into Washington, the Eagle Creek fire. So, as the news said, in Oregon's Columbia River Gorge, a blaze known as the Eagle Creek Fire has jumped the river, the Columbia River that is, into the state of Washington, creating dramatic and dangerous scenes. Another news report called this a devastating summer in which an area larger than a certain state has burned. I hate to have Rhode Island be used as a unit of measure, but that's what they said. An area larger than Rhode Island has burned this summer. And they're looking not just at the loss of Sperry Chalet, but potentially losing Lake McDonald Lodge, a loss that would, says the historian who's worked at the lodge for years, be unimaginably devastating. Some of the most remarkable buildings anywhere in the United States, and they are an integral part of the glacier experience and the glacier tradition, and they're either burned or at risk of burning. And if you're in those western states, it's not just in the high, dry forests. If you go down to the oceans, climate change is whacking away at them too. The Oregon and Washington razor clam fisheries are currently closed due to high levels of domoic acid. Domoic acid is a toxin that is produced by algae, the algae Pseudonychia. And algae are associated with climate change. For instance, a record-breaking red tide in 2015 was likely linked to climate change, and we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. Now, of course, the dry part of what's happening in our climate has really been drowned out by what we're seeing on the wet part. The New York Times recently ran an article saying that climate change doesn't cause extreme events, it amplifies them. On the climate side of risk, we have unambiguous evidence that the hazards are changing. Our emissions of heat-trapping gases have already increased the likelihood and severity of heat waves, extreme rainfall, and storm surges. Scientists can now even evaluate how much climate change has increased the odds of individual extreme events, including rainfall and flooding. And we certainly understand the mechanisms. Put simply, a warmer atmosphere can hold more water, increasing the potential for heavy downpours. Storm surge now occurs on top of sea level rise, increasing flooding risk. And we know by the law of thermal expansion why the seas rise when they warm. And we measure that they're warming with a very complicated device called a thermometer. And warmer oceans, in turn, produce more intense hurricanes. We know that as well, as has occurred in the North Atlantic and the Gulf. The article continues that unprecedented is increasingly the norm. And it notes up to 8 feet of sea level rise is possible in this century. Rhode Island's in a unique place, so we're riding a little bit higher than average, and we're looking at potentially 9 feet of sea level rise. Harvey has been an astonishing monster of a storm. It was described in one article as 9 trillion gallons of water, a hydraulic cube over downtown Houston, 4 miles square and 2 miles high. And then the author said the cube doubled to become the most extreme rain event in American history. Harvey, by the way, is the third 500-year flood in the Houston area in the past 3 years. It dumped enough water in southeastern Texas to equal almost 20 times the daily discharge of the Mississippi River. So while the wildfires are burning out west, this astonishing set of deluges is happening elsewhere. Land temperatures, according to NOAA, were the hottest they've ever been in 1,651 months of record keeping. July also marked 384 months since the last colder than average month in NASA's database. 384 months since we had a month that was colder than average, with July well warmer than average. The last 3 consecutive years, 2014, 2015, and 2016, each set a new global record for warmth, according to NOAA. 2016, Politico writes, has been confirmed as the planet's hottest year, with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration documenting record-breaking global warming trends of 2016. The observed outcomes of swiftly rising temperatures include the highest sea levels ever recorded, extremes in rain cycles, and declines in global ice and snow cover, with last year the third in a row breaking global temperature records. Several markers, such as land and ocean temperatures, sea level, and greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, broke records set just 1 year prior, the NOAA report said. The long-term climate change is like riding an escalator over time, riding it up, and on top of that, things like El Nino and La Nina are like jumping up and down on that escalator, one of the NOAA scientists said. So that's what we're seeing, the underlying trend of climate change raising temperatures, with El Nino and La Nina creating a variation like jumping up and down on that escalator. Greenhouse gas concentrations are now higher than ever recorded. Global surface temperatures are now the highest on record. Sea levels are the highest they've ever been since record keeping began. Precipitation cycles are becoming more extreme. Antarctic sea ice levels are lower than ever recorded. Alpine glaciers have declined for 37 consecutive years. And there were more tropical cyclones. Something is going on. And that well-known far-left, liberal, outlet, USA Today, had its editorial board say the following: "Could proof grow any more powerful that humanity is responsible for a dangerously warming planet?" It referenced a quadrennial national climate assessment in which scientists from 13 federal agencies found that a rapid rise in temperatures since the 1980s in the United States represents the warmest period in 1,500 years. It quotes the report: "Many lines of evidence demonstrate that human activities, especially emission of greenhouse gases, are primarily responsible. There are no alternative explanations." Do you hear that? There are no alternative explanations. And it keeps coming down. There was an article that came out while we were away on the Great Flood of 2016 in Louisiana, the worst rainstorm in a rainy state's history, the article called it. In some places, more than 2 feet of rain fell over 3 days. And as the article goes, research has shown that it was clearly linked to climate change. There were 2 separate teams of scientists that linked Louisiana's Great Flood with climate change, and the state's own meteorologist, a gentleman named Barry Keim, a professor at Louisiana State University, said that aspects of the August storm were consistent with climate change, and that both of the climate studies so far have shown it likely that climate change likely had its fingerprints on that Louisiana disaster. Indeed, in Louisiana, the state is mounting a massive battle against rising seas as well as floods. Along the coast, rising waters and escalating flood insurance rates, the article says, will drive thousands of families further inland. This is what the state predicts. These families leaving behind homes they've known for generations, leaving behind places that have fundamentally shaped their identities. As one of the Louisianans living in the area in question said, "This is the first time that I can remember that a group came in and said, 'It's not going to be all right.'" Over the next 2 generations, flooding in Louisiana along the marshes and coast will happen at an alarming scale, the article says, as the twin challenges of sinking land and rising seas overtake ancestral homes at breakneck speed. In 50 years, the state estimates Terrebonne Parish, whose name means good earth in the French that some of its residents still speak, will lose 41% of its landmass. Areas are obviously going to lose their tax bases, the report says, as rising waters and increasing flood insurance rates drive most locals out. Now, the Louisiana planners, the article said, had a bit of a leg up since the environmental changes here, the article says, have been so swift that many residents have seen land lost in their own lifetimes. When you're seeing it happen before your eyes, it's not so easy to deny it. And indeed, it's affecting local markets. New gated communities in the area advertise higher elevations on bright advertising banners facing the highway. In Louisiana, what had been the worst-case scenario for land loss when the legislature passed its 2012 version of the master plan became the best-case scenario in the latest version, approved by the legislature in June, thanks to updated sea level rise estimates. So we're in Louisiana. We're in a Republican-controlled legislature. They pass a master plan to address flooding in 2012. That master plan is based on has a worst-case scenario, and just in the 5 years since then, that worst-case scenario, the legislature has now updated to become a best-case scenario, with the worst-case scenario far, far exceeding what they anticipated just as recently as 2012. Climate change and water management practices could significantly alter the magnitude and variability of extreme flooding events, causing flooding to become non-stationary, said the article, Deciphering Deluges. We've got to come up with new ways of looking at how to cope with sea level rise, offshore storms, major tropical storms, downpours, and riverine flooding. And right now, our colleague Bill Nelson has left us this afternoon after the vote to go back down to Florida because Hurricane Irma is steaming towards his state. Hurricane Irma is the most powerful storm ever recorded in the Atlantic Ocean. Experts say Irma's strength is a result of unusually warm water for that part of the Atlantic. Guess what global warming does? Raises ocean temperatures. You know how much of the excess heat created by global warming has actually gone into the oceans? About 93%. Virtually all of it. Thank goodness for the oceans. Without them, we'd already be baking in climate change. 93% went into the oceans, but of course that raises ocean temperatures, and on go the storms. If Irma stays on the forecast track and reaches the Florida Straits, the water there is warm enough that the already intense storm could become much worse, with wind speeds potentially reaching 225 miles per hour, warned Kerry Emanuel, an MIT meteorology professor. For the Florida Keys, if you were to create the worst-case scenario, that is what we are looking at, Monroe County Emergency Operations Center Director Martin Centerfit told CBS Miami. Even Tropical Storm Emily some time ago dumped enough rain on Miami Beach, 7 inches of rainfall over several hours, that the pumps that are meant to drain the area went offline for nearly an hour because the power was interrupted. The mayor, Tomas Regalado, used the flooding to make a case for a proposed $400 million bond initiative to help pump the water out. We have infrastructure demands that come from this disaster as well. So a pretty good summary came, again, from an article in the New York Times, an editorial piece. What's going on? Well, first, hurricanes arise from warm waters, and the Gulf of Mexico has warmed by 2 to 4 degrees Fahrenheit above the long-term average. The result is more intense storms. There is a general consensus that the frequency of high category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes should increase as the climate warms, says the same scientist at MIT. Second, as the air warms, warm air holds more water vapor, so the storms dump more rain. That's why there's been a big increase in heavy downpours. 9 of the top 10 years for heavy downpours in the United States have occurred since 1990. Climate change played a role in intensifying the winds and rainfall associated with Hurricane Harvey, says Charles Green, the climate scientist at Cornell. Last year was the 3rd in a row to set a record high for global average surface temperature. The 10 years of greatest loss of sea ice are all in the last decade. Houston has suffered 3 500-year floods in the last 3 years. And so, the author asks the question, why can't we all respect scientists' predictions about our cooking of our only planet? How is it that we don't listen to the scientists on this, particularly right here in this room, in this chamber? Well, there were two very interesting articles that came out while we were away that addressed this. One is about a phony group called the Cooler Heads Coalition, whose job is to call climate science a hoax and denounce environmentalists as global warming alarmists. They write letters, blast out emails, pressure lawmakers, sponsor seminars, appear on television. They even made a documentary movie. This article in the Washington Post told the story behind this coalition. Obviously, the coalition, this Cooler Heads crowd, is paid for. The Cooler Heads have received more than $11 million in donations over the years from coal and oil companies. Who knew? They've taken in tens of millions from nonprofit foundations, such as those controlled by the wealthy Koch brothers. Guess what? More fossil fuel money. The Koch brothers run a fossil fuel empire. The Cooler Heads Coalition are allied with industry trade groups and public relations companies and lobbyists, all of whom are working to influence public debate about global warming. Climate scientists said there is no doubt about the reality of climate change and its consequences, including melting polar ice caps, rising sea levels, and the intensification of storms. Benjamin Santer is a scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. We're pretty proud of our national laboratories, and we usually don't think that people who are there are idiots or are fooling us or are parts of a hoax. Dr. Santer says, oh, by the way, he also received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. He told the Washington Post that this Cooler Heads outfit is attempting to turn back the clock on knowledge and science. The history of this is rooted in a complex influence campaign that began in support of tobacco. The tobacco plan foreshadowed the tactics that Cooler Heads members would soon employ on climate change. First, millions in contributions from affected industries, often laundered through front groups and through foundations. The same array of donors, the Washington Post reports, would help finance charities behind the fight against climate science. They took the skills they learned denying the health harms of tobacco and moved that same technology of propaganda, influence, and politicking into climate change. The Competitive Enterprise Institute became the lead group in this Cooler Heads coalition, taking over management of the coalition, joined by groups such as the Heartland Institute. The Heartland Institute's a really classy group. They're the ones who put up billboards comparing climate scientists to the Unabomber. That's the quality of debate we get out of the Heartland Institute. And Americans for Prosperity is another influential nonprofit organization, which is a front for, guess whom? The Koch brothers and Koch Industries, i.e. the fossil fuel industry. They got particularly cranked up by the Kyoto Protocol. And the story continues. The energy industry went on a spending spree to thwart Kyoto, devoting at least $13 million to public relations and information campaigns in 1997. The Cooler Heads Coalition was in effect a loose confederation of those groups with the declared mission of countering what they call the myths of global warming. In early 1998, this Cooler Heads group met with energy industry executives and lobbyists in closed-door meetings at the American Petroleum Institute and began to soak up more money. And here's what the plan was. I'm quoting from the story in the Post. one former Cooler Heads member who spoke on the condition of anonymity because of a fear of a punitive backlash. That's how classy this group is. They enforce against each other. This former member said the coalition's mission was to simulate a cacophony of voices against climate change science. There's a whole web, the former member said, out to do this. The ExxonMobil Foundation, of course, had given millions to Cooler Heads members. A 2009 IRS filing for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the group that took over the coalition, managed it, inadvertently made public a filing that disclosed their funding from two coal mining companies, Ohio-based Murray Energy and Richmond-based Massey Energy. Contributions to the Competitive Enterprise Institute during the Obama administration rose to $7.6 million in 2014. And as the article continues, Competitive Enterprise Institute and the Cooler Heads, so-called, were just the tip of the spear. Between 2003 and 2010, energy companies, corporations, conservative foundations contributed hundreds of millions to that web, to 91 nonprofit think tanks, educational groups, and associations involved in the fight against global warming regulations. To put it mildly, as the expert who chronicled this concluded, and I quote him, "This is a large-scale political effort." We have one last report from inside that large-scale political effort. This is the first-hand voice of the individual. His name is Jerry Taylor. Here's what he says. "I used to be the #2 person at the Cato Institute." The Cato Institute is one of this constellation of right-wing groups that foment and support climate denial and receives money from fossil fuel interests. He continues, "I was responsible for building our resistance to climate action. I discovered that a lot of the scientific narratives I was offering were really dodgy. One of the people I trusted most," he discovered, "was in the business of consciously misrepresenting the debate. This really rattled me." He goes on, "Once I started looking closely at a lot of the convenient, plausible talking points I was offering, they began to fall apart. I then turned to look at economic arguments." He says, "This is pretty hard. It's a very difficult thing to find that you cannot trust any of the scientists that are being offered to resist climate action." This is the guy who used to lead the anti-climate action effort of the Cato Institute, saying it is a very difficult thing to find that you cannot trust any of the scientists that are being offered to resist climate action. And then the economists that you have been relying on to put cautious remarks about cost-benefit are now all walking away from the game. He goes on to say, "We got to the point where you could not find an academic economist who studies climate change who argued against climate action. Not one single one. So, here's his conclusion. Believe it or not, he says, libertarians and conservatives and Republicans were put on this earth with the perfect answer to climate change: harnessing markets and price signals via a carbon tax or a carbon tax-like mechanism to reduce greenhouse gas emission. We're perfectly placed to do that, he says. So, what is it, he asks, that keeps Republicans from coming to the conclusion that climate change doesn't just threaten polar bears in the Arctic, it threatens the global economy, it threatens capital flows, it threatens capitalism? It's not the Republican base, let me tell you, he says. There's poll after poll, survey after survey, showing that most Republicans believe in doing something about climate. He continues, what prevents Republican politicians from acting is that there are significant members in the Republican Party coalition who are denialist demanders. They're not just climate deniers themselves, they are denialist demanders, and they have outsized influence in the party. He says the Koch-controlled, and by that I mean the Koch brothers and Koch Industries, the Koch-controlled Tea Party movement has held the GOP by the throat. And by the way, if you were somebody who was trying to find some comfort in the widely reported phenomenon that 97% of climate scientists conclude that global warming is real and problematic for the planet and has been exacerbated by human activity, if you were comforting yourself that maybe the 3% were right, that the really smart place to place your bet for the future of the planet and our economy and our standing in the world is on those 3%, not take the 97% bet. No, take the 3% bet. If that's the way you were thinking, you got bad news. Researchers tried to replicate the results of those 3% of papers. And guess what? They found biased, faulty results. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist at Texas Tech University. She said this: every single one of those analyses had an error in their assumptions, methodology, or analysis. That, when corrected, brought their results into line with the scientific consensus. So if you were hoping that that 3% was somehow going to bail you out from having to face this crisis, that just blew up. There is no 3%. Broadly, the report on this says, there were three main errors in the papers denying climate change. Many had cherry-picked the results. Some applied inappropriate curve fitting to try to step away from the data until you could match it to the curve of your own choosing. And sometimes, this is my favorite, sometimes the papers just ignored physics altogether. So it's been quite a month with the West ablaze, Houston underwater, the most powerful storm ever measured in the Atlantic headed our way, heat and rain and other measures breaking records year after year after year, multiple departments of government aligning to warn us, and how does the Trump administration respond? Well, the Energy Department asked scientists to remove the word climate change from a grant proposal. I have been asked to contact you to update the wording in your proposed abstract to remove words such as global warming or climate change, the email says. Not just one fluke. In March, Politico reported that staff at the Department of Energy were told not to use the terms climate change, emissions reduction, or Paris Agreement. The department put out a power grid study that has been long delayed, and in the power grid study, the words climate change never appeared. Wherever they were in earlier drafts, they got scrubbed. The only reference to climate is a reference to rescinding energy and climate-related policies. The EPA has been scrubbing the word climate change from its website. It removed its climate change page and then got hammered with a series of Freedom of Information Act requests as to what's going on with that. So they quickly scrambled and published an archived version, but buried it back in the website. The Department of Interior has also removed discussions of the effects of global warming from several of its pages. The Department of Agriculture has emails showing how staff in their Natural Resources Conservation Service were coached by managers to avoid the term climate change and instead use other language. That's where we are. All of those facts, the motive behind it, the fingerprints of the fossil fuel industry, the confessions by participants in those schemes, and where are we? In this room, silence. Nobody will talk about it because the power of the fossil fuel industry is so strong, the threats are so blood-curdling that nobody dares. We cannot have a grown-up, factual discussion about climate change in this building either. And of course, over in the Trump administration, they've completely thrown in the towel to the fossil fuel industry and now are hoping to dodge the problem by forbidding people from using the word climate change. It is pathetic, Mr. President. And with that, I yield the floor.